Welcome back to another episode of the Shared Practices podcast. I have with me here my co-host for the season, Dr. Jonas Ashbaugh. Jonas, how's it going today?
Hey, fantastic. How you doing?
Doing good, Jonas. And I'm excited for today's episode. We're going to talk about lease negotiation. I think we talked about leases in season 2 as it pertains to acquisitions, but I think their importance is crucial in a startup. And Jonas, as someone who's going through a startup or, now open, talk about the importance of the lease itself in the whole project.
The lease is not something to be underestimated. It's one of the most important documents that you sign. And I really think that Matt brought a lot of knowledge to this podcast. I really think that he really was able to break it down step by step and how to tackle this head on, or how to seek proper help and how to evaluate that help to make sure they're doing you a service.
Yeah, and I think lease negotiation is such a I think there's not many people who really specialize in it, but when you can get somebody on air, it's very valuable. So I hope you guys enjoy the episode, and in the outro, we'll have more thoughts on the specific things in the lease and their importance. So without further ado, Matt LaMaster.
All right. Welcome back to another episode of Shared Practices. I am your guest host, Dr. Jonas Ashbaugh. And here today we have a special guest. It is Matt LaMaster, Esquire. I'm saying that correctly. He is is that correct?
Esquire. It's a funny name.
Yeah, it is.
Sounds way too fancy.
Yeah, nothing too
fancy. Basically it means attorney.
And we're here today to talk about dental leases, and specifically dental leases for a start practice. One of the most important documents that you will sign going forward for the next 5, 10, 15 years, or however long you're going to sign it. And I personally have used Matt, and I brought him on today because I thought he'd be a great expert to have on to discuss this topic. Leases are a big deal, and like I said, you're signing something that's going to lock you in for however many years, and you want to make sure that it's written in some fashion towards your favor, because most of them are not. Wouldn't you agree, Matt?
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely. A lease is a long-term contract for most people. I mean, most dentists, anybody for that matter, normally is not going to sign a lease for 6 months or a year. Most leases are 3, 5, 10 with multiple options. And so they're going to go on, for an extended period of time. The most important thing, I think, is making sure you have somebody advising you on what is important, and whether that's an attorney or a broker or a consultant, you really need somebody on your side with these things, because they're not written for you, the startup. They're not written for the dentist. They're written for the landlord. That's the only reason they exist. So it's extremely important. If you look at what you're paying in rent and you spread that out over the 5 or 10 years, most times it's going to be $250,000 to $500,000 or more. You would never enter into something where you were going to pay that much money and not have somebody look at it.
Oh yeah,
it surprises me how many people do that, though.
Even up to $1 million, I've seen.
Right
on some of these leases. So when would you bring in that expert? When do you usually step in to speak on behalf of the dentist you're representing?
Right. Well, Jonas, I'm going to take one step back, and I apologize for not saying this earlier. Obviously, I'm an attorney. That's that fancy what that Esquire means. I am licensed in Michigan, Florida, and Wisconsin, and we're on here today, having some of an informal conversation. Jonas and I are trying to give some good information to all the people listening as it relates to their startup. But this is not legal advice. So I'm going to be giving some general information. Jonas is obviously going to be asking some questions, and I'll be giving you my thoughts and opinion over the multiple leases that we review. I'd say we probably review anywhere between 50 and 60 leases a year. And so it's just a little bit of our experience, and there's a lot of different opinions and advice that you can get. But, to answer your question right there, Jonas, on when you should bring in an expert, my opinion is the earlier the better. And look, by expert, I don't mean an attorney necessarily. I'm very conscious of my clients' costs and expenses. And so having somebody on your side that understands what a lease is and how to negotiate a lease as early as possible is good. And doing so without having to pay somebody is even better, right? Can you have an expert for free? Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, you can find a good lease negotiator space finder, broker, consultant, whatever you want to call them. And some of them won't charge you to start that negotiation process. The big thing that I see starting this is finding your location. That's really where all this comes at the beginning. That's where it starts. Really, it starts whether or not you want to do a startup. But next thing is, if once you know, you got to go find a space. And so where is the hot market, right? You got to know where that is. And so an expert sometimes in that particular area can help you. I have a broker that I work with that actually just negotiated a killer deal for a dentist because the landlord had no idea that there was about to be 3,000 homes built directly behind this building.
That's amazing.
Right. So you have an expert that's representing a tenant that knows the market and was able to get this space at like $12 a square foot when really it's really worth a lot more than that. And so
that's killer.
That's a free expert that's out for you trying to help you out. So I would say the earlier the better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have some experience with I worked with you and you kind of came on board with me after I'd already used one of the free lease negotiators, but keeping them on board. And I think what we ran into was they were continually trying to deliver, their service to keep working at it. And it almost went to a point of burning the bridge between myself and the landlord. So they can actually do some harm when they think they're doing good. They're trying to negotiate so hard that it gets contentious and they start advising you in certain directions that you can actually lose a deal, which was actually a good deal to start with.
A good deal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think most lease negotiators, space finders, brokers, and all. By the way, those all have some differences in their own right. But having somebody on the front end do that is helpful. But it's important to note that some of them break down their fee schedule a little bit different. So there are what I think most times they would call themselves lease negotiators. They're not attorneys. But and oftentimes they're not actually finding the space for you. They are negotiating the major lease terms. And I think we'll go over those here in a little bit. But when they do that, oftentimes those guys will charge a flat fee. So when they, maybe they'll charge $5,000 or $10,000, those guys aren't free. And that's fine. If you want to use somebody like that, that's perfectly fine. And I think their value add, what they say is, look, I'm not free, so I'm not going to just do a deal to just get paid. A lot of brokers, well, that's the bad side of brokers, I suppose. Some of them, they'll just do a deal, whether it's necessarily the best for their client, because when they do the deal, they get paid.
Mm-hmm.
So then you have brokers like the one you had used, and there's a lot of others out there that operate similar to like a residential real estate agent, where they're representing the buyer and they don't get paid by the buyer, they get paid by the landlord or the seller. So to you, the tenant, that means they're free. But like you had said, sometimes those people will push too far. My experience, though, is, Jonas, generally the free ones push just hard enough to give you a good deal, but they don't want to quite push hard enough to kill the deal because they don't get paid.
That's right. Yeah, it's definitely something to be watchful of. And also when they do that split commission thing, is that they're finding the local expert that they find, because they're usually working, nationwide. The local expert, the local commercial real estate agent is usually not very experienced at all, but they're willing to do anything to get a commission at this point. So you don't really have that local advice on the ground. That's about my experience. But yeah, like you brought up, let's break down the terms. So you start out with an LOI, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was going to say. Really, you start out with a letter of intent. So LOI stands for letter of intent. There's a handful of other names for it, but really the idea is, okay, what are the major terms? You found a location, or maybe you found 3 locations, and your broker, or maybe even yourself, go in and you say, okay, here's the major terms we want. We need to know what we're going to be paying for rent. We need to be able to know what we're going to have in terms of our TI, our tenant improvement allowance money, which is money given to you. We need to know what it's going to be delivered in, what the condition of the premise is going to be delivered in. We need to know what the term is. Hey, how long is this thing? And we need to know whether there's options. I mean, those are some of the really, really big ticket items that are put into a letter of intent. Some letters of intent go deeper than that, depending on who drafts them, how comprehensive your broker is or maybe how comprehensive the landlord is. But the letter of intent, think of it as just those biggest items that you could possibly think of. Do we have a deal on these big items?
Yeah, I've heard it referred to as
that's really where this starts.
As setting the economics of the lease. So, how much you're going to pay, how long you're going to stay there, when can you renew it, how long are the terms for renewal, how are they going to help pay for a portion of your build out, and just setting the numbers so that you guys know where each other stand, and if they're agreeable, you guys can move forward into the lease, because the lease will also takes up time and money to draft in and of itself.
Correct. Yeah. Generally, those letters of intent are non-binding. It's worth mentioning. However, you need to be careful to make sure some landlord letters of intent can get kind of tricky in terms of, maybe if you back out, maybe they're going to charge you some money because they had to have their attorney draft it. You got to be a little bit careful, especially on the landlord written ones, that you're not going to be expected to pay any costs if you back out. But most of them are non-binding. So the really important thing is, how in depth do you want to get? My opinion on letters of intent, because generally, again, most of them are non-binding, is how much detail do you want in that letter of intent to know that you're going to move forward? I think the biggest advantage of having a letter of intent is that you mitigate the possibility that you guys are going to, the landlord and the tenant, are going to disagree or not have an agreement on a very important issue at the 11th hour.
Mm-hmm.
And you would have all wasted time, energy, and effort getting to the 11th hour to then have a deal fall apart. Like, for instance, the personal guarantee.
Yes.
I've seen letters of intent not mention a personal guarantee at all. So does that mean there's not one? Probably not. There probably is one. But if you didn't expect one as a tenant and they throw one into the lease, well, your attorney and you are probably going to say, well, we didn't know there was one. And they're going to say, well, we don't care if you knew there was one. We're going to make there will be one. And then you go, well, I can't sign this lease if there's not a personal guarantee. The deal falls apart.
Do you feel, you mentioned personal guarantee. Do you feel it's a bad thing? I mean, I feel like that's expected from a landlord. If I was a landlord, I'd want a personal guarantee.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. It is. It really is expected. I mean, there's a lot of attorneys out there, and in the perfect world, if I'm representing a tenant, I don't want a guarantee at all. I mean, I don't want one for you. I don't want one for your spouse. I just don't want one. But anymore in today's world, it is common, and it is pretty much to be expected to have some level of guarantee, some level of personal guarantee from the tenant. Some attorneys may disagree with me and say you can't ever have one of your clients sign a personal guarantee. Well, I don't think that's accurate. I don't think it's reality.
I don't think you get a deal done.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the economics of the lease amount. What kind of lease amounts, like price per square foot, are you seeing around the country or the areas that you represent?
Yeah. So one of the big things is in terms of the dollar amount. I think it's really important to frame this in what we're talking about from the economics and rent. There are two major types of leases. Probably most people listening to this podcast have heard other podcasts, so they probably know what I'm about to say. But there are gross leases and there are net leases. And I'm paraphrasing here. A lot of people will explain this a little bit differently, but a gross lease is a lease that is basically you're paying an all-in dollar amount as a tenant. So if the dollar amount is $2,000 a month, that should be all you're paying in rent in a gross lease. It's just it. You pay $2,000 a month.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a net lease, most net leases are triple net leases or modified net leases. You can go into that a lot. But it is very important to understand the dynamics of what the triple net includes and doesn't include. So a triple net lease oftentimes includes three things. Number one, it's going to have like four things, I guess, technically. So number one, you have a base rent. So you remember I said that $2,000 a month.
Mm-hmm.
It has that, which is base rent. Then you're also going to pay your proportionate share, should be your proportionate share of the real estate taxes. So if you're in a 10,000 square foot building and you have 5,000 square feet of it, which I know is big for a dental office, so let's say 2,500 square feet, then you're going to be paying 25%. So if you have 2,500 square feet in a 10,000 square foot space, you're going to be paying 25% of the real estate taxes. They're going to be charged to you. Then you're going to pay 25% of the insurance that the landlord has on the property. The other thing you're going to pay is 25% of what the common area maintenance charges are, or other, operating expense, operating costs. There's a lot of different names for it, but it's basically all the other costs that the landlord has. So, Jonas, to answer your question on like, what am I seeing in terms of rent?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to know whether or not that's a gross or triple net lease, because the big thing is when landlords advertise, they may advertise $12 a square foot. Well, is that $12 a square foot triple net? So that means you're adding another, let's say $3, $4, $5 of triple net charges onto it, which effectively makes it, say, $17 a square foot.
Mm-hmm.
Or are they advertising a $15 a square foot gross lease? So you as a tenant may go, hey, I'm paying $12 a square foot. Well, no, you're not. You're paying $17 eventually.
Yep.
And so you pass up on the $15 a square foot space, not knowing that it was actually a gross lease.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for clarifying that. Are you seeing a lot of gross leases?
No, I don't. So that's a good point, right?
Yeah.
So we don't see a lot of gross leases anymore. If you're renting from, there's really like three types of landlords. There's the guy who owns, one or two buildings that really doesn't know what he's doing necessarily. Most of those guys will maybe try to do a gross lease because they don't understand what a triple net lease is. Then you have what I would call, I guess they're not institutional landlords. Let me put it this way. There's institutional landlords, which are on the total other end, that own multiple properties, complex leases, very onerous leases. They know what they're doing and they know how to charge you. Almost every single one of those is a triple net lease.
They usually have in-house counsel, in-house representation.
Sometimes they will, or they'll have large firms be representing them.
Mm-hmm.
On the outside. They're outside counsel, but they have larger firms representing them. So oftentimes those are also, you may see this when you run across it. It's called a REIT, real estate investment trust.
Okay.
They're companies that own multiple properties and they own real estate. And oftentimes there's medical real estate investment trusts that sometimes a lot of dentists will be getting into. But besides that, there's that middle ground of somebody who owns, maybe 5, 10 properties. They're more of a regional type of player. Sometimes you'll see gross leases there, or maybe you'll see a modified net lease that's not quite full net, like a triple net. So, but we don't see a lot of gross leases unless it's somebody who's not overly sophisticated in owning one property. And it's a lot more simple to go, okay, you pay me $2,000 a month.
Yep.
And that's all it is. But I would tell you, again, to go back, sometimes I get off course here, but to go back to answer your question on what am I seeing in terms of rental rates, the lowest I see is like $10. I mean, I don't know that I've seen anything less than $10 in a long, long time. Most on the lower end are like $12 and $13, but I mean, those are pretty rare anymore. I would say somewhere around 16, 15, 16 to 20 is more common. And then, we have some clients over, in the Naples area, or Orlando has a couple really hot markets. Really every metro area will have a really hot market. I mean, I had a rental rate of like $37 a square foot. I thought it was, I honestly couldn't believe it when I saw it. But, the market
that could be almost like $100,000 a year plus.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, it was an extremely, extremely, extremely hot market. And, I think there was room for growth there, and it was very high end, obviously, as well. So, and it was a brand new building, but generally we're around the $15 to $20 range.
So we've talked a lot about what's required to take that great step forward into your first practice. There are so many elements to consider in this process that it's easy to downplay the importance of one absolutely critical component, location. Or as the marketing gurus say, location, location, location. many of our colleagues limit themselves and their potential success by simply trusting a realtor to find an appropriate space. Realtors have a wide wealth of knowledge and local knowledge, but even a commercial specialist is unlikely to know or understand the unique criteria that can make or break a dental practice. However, our sponsor, Design Ergonomics, is familiar with these criteria because they've been designing, equipping, and training the nation's most productive offices for the last 20 years. Dental Ergonomics offers a clarity site selection service that covers an astounding number of individual data points, over 100. These include population demographics, traffic patterns, visibility, municipal regulations, the competitive landscape, and more. Running these points through an analysis algorithm, they provide a simple, categorized report and an overall ranking, making it much easier to compare locations. This can be an invaluable tool to narrow down your targets. If you've pinpointed a few potential sites on your own or through a realtor, but as a busy dentist, we often don't have time to do the initial search in the first place. And if you're looking in an area 30 or 40 miles away, you may not know exactly where to start. The logistics of that might be challenging and will be very time consuming. Regardless, Design Ergonomics has a solution here as well, a second level of site selection called Focus. With the Focus site selection, the research will do the legwork for you. Through remote and on-site investigation, they'll generate profiles for up to 5 top-notch locations that'll work with your vision and goals. This allows you to make an informed decision just on the right spot to build the practice of your dreams. For more information on site selection and other dental ergonomic services, go to www.desergo.com. Enter promo code shared location on the contact page to receive a $300 off discount of Clarity or Focus site selection services for a limited time. Again, that's www.desergo.com. Enter the promo code shared location on the contact page to receive a discount off of the Clarity or Focus site selection services.
Yeah, and I think that's something to be conscious of too, because there is, when you get these startup loans from Bank of America or Wells Fargo, there is like a middle ground. They want you to fit in this box of, having the right lease numbers. And, even though it's like a hot area, you may not get approved because your lease amount might be outside or above what they're comfortable with you paying. So there's something to be conscious of and something to ask your loan broker about too. Like, what's the maximum amount that they feel comfortable funding and knowing
That's
that.
a very good point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very good point. Yeah.
So you set the LOI and you guys go back and forth. So that you're at that level. You're at the LOI. You're kind of at this point. The dentist has kind of turned you loose, and you're free to discuss on their behalf with the landlord. Am I right?
Right.
Right. And
yeah. So once we get the LOI, the broker or whoever's representing you or you tell them, okay, we signed this letter of intent. Landlord, draft me a lease.
Yes. And so what are you seeing? What are some of the pitfalls in some of these leases that you're getting back? I'm sure that's a loaded question.
Yeah, it is a loaded question. The way I explain what we do to clients when I talk to them on the phone the first time I talk to them is I tell them that we do 3 things. And I want to be very clear. This is not a sales pitch, but I just feel like this is what most attorneys or anybody for that matter should do. And I'm a fairly simple-minded guy, so I want to do 3 things. Okay, number 1, I got to check and I got to make sure that the letter of intent terms found their way into the lease. You would be surprised at how many times the terms in a letter of intent don't get in the lease, whether that's rental amount, whether that's start date, whether that's an exclusivity for you. It's just, anything. It's amazing sometimes won't be in there. Mm-hmm. I mean, the rental rate's been wrong before. So the first thing you do is you got to double check the letter of intent finds its way into the lease. And with that, we want to make sure that it's written into the lease properly. So sometimes I don't think it's nefarious on the landlord. Sometimes I don't think they're really trying to mess anybody up or try to take advantage. I just don't think they properly drafted them because most landlords aren't those institutional landlords. Most landlords, pulled a lease offline or had a lease from 20 years ago they got from their attorney, and they don't even know what the heck it says. So they go in and they change their own terms but don't know what it means. So you got to make sure the letter of intent's right. The next thing that we do is we go in and we'll go and try to find what I would say is bad language. Okay, it's a very general term, right? So what is bad language? And we try to go in and scratch out, again, general term, the bad language. I try to get as much bad language out as I can that I know is commercially reasonable. There's a lot of bad language that honestly is reasonable. I know it kind of sounds weird, but it's in every lease. And if it's already in there for us to take it out, it's not really, it wouldn't look right. It wouldn't be right for us to do that. But number two is, like I said, we take as much bad language out as we can. And then number three, part of the process is we're going to go in and we're going to try to add some good language. So for instance, death and disability clause, try to open up and try to allow you to be able to maybe assign it or sublease it without as much control by the landlord. Maybe try to limit the guarantee, try to limit the as-is nature of the lease and the premises.
Okay.
Some of those, obviously, if there's not exclusivity, we'll add that in. So that's what I mean by like adding some good provisions or some goodies and we'll try to get those in there. Some are more important than others. Some are more of a wish list, but that's the process. LOI, take the bad stuff out and put some good stuff in. That's generally what we're trying to do.
Okay. I'm going to take a step back here. So I still have a question I want to ask you kind of in terms of the LOI and when you're getting that. Let's go with, how do you feel about one landlord giving tenant improvement allowance versus a vanilla shell space? That's the question I want to ask you. And I know there's a lot of detail about that.
Yeah. So you're saying in terms of them, if it's a gray shell, and for people that are listening, there's a couple different colors that people throw out there. A gray shell is something where there's basically no drywall, no ceiling in. There's no white. I know it sounds kind of weird, but there's no white because there's no drywall and a ceiling is usually white. The vanilla shell is something where you've got drywall up and you've got a ceiling in or a drop ceiling or at least the grid of the drop ceiling in. Some more work has been done. And so there's a lot of variations throughout there, and it's important to know what your landlord is going to provide to you because ultimately, again, wherever it starts with your landlord, the day you look at it, you've got to get it to the point where you're going to be able to practice in it. Mm-hmm. So the question I think you're getting at is who does that and what kind of delegation do you want to put on that? Is the landlord going to get it to a certain point where you're going to have them do a lot of work and then you're going to do kind of the finishing touches, or are you as the tenant going to start from gray and get it to the point where you're at? And what's the cost of that?
Yeah, it's really like putting a dollar figure to. So, for instance, in a vanilla shell situation, and I actually didn't realize the thing about the gray shell, it can be just completely bare. But in like a vanilla shell situation, is that they're providing bathrooms or providing like fire sprinkler systems and maybe some lighting and things like that. And it's very hard to put a dollar figure to that versus in like a TI tenant improvement allowance situation. They may be providing the gray shell. But they're also providing a dollar figure per square foot in help in improving that space. So, it's hard to argue against one way or another, but I have to say, I think that the tenant improvement would be a better situation for me personally.
Yeah, it depends on how much you trust the landlord to do the work right.
Yeah.
Okay. So some landlords, depending on what it is. So if they're putting in a door and they're putting in sprinklers and they're putting in maybe a bathroom and you don't have any like special requirements for that bathroom, like any sorts of like fixtures or, it's a very vanilla, I don't mean to use that term again, but it's just a plain bathroom and you trust them to do that, then that's fine. But, really once the work starts to become more of a dental specific in nature, most landlords don't have the experience of building out a dental space. So I think your point is, you have the space where how you want it to be, and you've hired a contractor, and so you would rather do it yourself and get the money from the landlord. That's what you're saying. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. But some leases you have no choice. They're going to do vanilla shell, and that's all they're going to do. They're not going to give you any TI money. Is that a situation
Right.
where you just have to eat it and say, this is my space, this is what I have to do. I guess this is the deal I take, or how do you negotiate a
That
difference there?
Yeah, I mean, that conversation is one with multiple parties in it. That's you as the tenant, that's your CPA understanding what the cost is going to be, and that's the lender and your broker, being able to really figure out how much can we get out of this, but not only just how much can we get out of it, but how much do we really need? Because I think it's important to know that when you get tenant improvement allowance money, they say you're getting it, but it's not like you're not paying for it.
You're paying for it.
So, yeah, you're paying for it throughout the lease. It's not like they give it to you for free. So if you don't take the money from the lender on day one to do the work, because presumably you don't have the cash in hand, that's why you're asking for the TI, you're going to be getting it from the landlord, in which case generally they're building in some sort of interest rate or recapture rate on the money they're giving you. They're not just giving it to you for free.
Gotcha.
Unless they're really desperate, or maybe maybe they'll reduce the interest or whatever, the recapture on it. But it's not free money. So I guess it really depends on where you're at with your lending and how much money you have, because there's two sides of that coin. Do you want to take it from the landlord, in which case you're going to be paying it out through the lease, or do you want to take it from the lender, in which case you're going to be paying it in your loan from the lender? And how much money do you have in your loan money? What I find most often in startups is the reason why they're needing or getting TI is because they're buying equipment and they're needing to do their own improvements to, the finishes, if you will. And so they need the TI from the landlord because they can't because there's not enough money from the lender.
Sure.
And it's not because lenders won't give you enough money, but it's just a combination of those two. And it's a kind of an inner working and a mix of both of those that will get you there. But again, I want to be really clear. One of the most important things is who is building it out for you. And you do need bottom line is you have to have a clear indication of what they're going to be turning the space over to you in. Because if they didn't put fire sprinklers in there and your contractor didn't account for the fact that you need to put fire sprinklers in there, that's a big cost that you just missed. And that's going to be coming out of your loan.
And that you could be resubmitting permits, waiting for the township or city to approve them again. That's a big mess up.
Correct.
Yep.
Correct. Yep.
So what kind of going back to the leases? So what kind of pitfalls are you seeing when you get the leases?
Well, I think one of the big things with a lot of startups is because you're doing the build out. One of the things that we find is that the term and the effective date and the commencement date and the rent commencement date, and I'll go through those for you here, but that those dates either aren't properly defined or they're just not giving you enough time to build out. And so what's important is that you can identify generally what's called the effective date. And that's the date that maybe you sign, or it might be a date shortly in the future after you sign that the lease actually becomes effective. But there's another term oftentimes, it's called the commencement date. And the commencement date is the date, this is how it should usually be defined, is the date that the landlord provides you the space in the condition that they've said they're going to provide it in.
Yeah.
So to go back to that example, they said that they were going to put in a fire sprinkler, and they said they were going to put in, I don't know, whatever else, a drop ceiling and a bathroom. Well, they haven't done that yet. So it's not until the day that they give it to you the way they're supposed to give it to you, that's the commencement date.
Okay.
Generally what I like to see. Then you have something called the rent commencement date. And those are all three different things. And the rent commencement date is the date after the commencement date when your rent starts. So that date should usually be anywhere between 90 to probably 150 days, maybe, if you can get it stretched out that far, after they've provided you the space in the condition they're going to provide it to you in. Because once they've provided it to you, you also have to then do your build out. And sometimes the rent commencement date's defined as, and this isn't that big of a deal if it's negotiating as an LOI, sometimes the rent commencement date is 90 days after the commencement date or the sooner of when they open for business. So if you open for business, that's when your rent starts. But if you haven't opened for business, then your rent doesn't start for another 90 days. Yeah. And then a little caveat to that, and this relates to actually the rent itself is maybe rent commences, but maybe you got negotiated where you actually get 3 months of free rent or 3 months of abated rent, or maybe just 1 month of abated rent. Okay, whatever it is, you actually don't have to pay rent once rent commence starts. You actually don't have to pay rent for a month or 2 or 3. And so all that stuff gets negotiated on the front end. But if that's the case, then we're saying the rent starts, but I don't have to pay it for 2 months after rent starts.
So there's lots of different variations, many, many variations of how that can actually be executed.
Yes. And it gets confusing. It does. I mean, for a lot of people, because they're using similar words, a lot of the word commencement. And it depends on, how that really depends on how that word's defined and whether or not there's an additional, a rent commencement as well.
Definitely very smart to know those dates. And so what would you do if you walk into a site and, today's the day that they're supposed to be delivering, the site as they said it would, and it's not done? You just document that and what do you do?
Well, yeah. So sometimes what we try to do is in the landlord, there's usually exhibits. Let me take a step back. There's usually exhibits that'll say what the landlord's supposed to do, and there's another exhibit that'll say what the tenant's supposed to do. Now, sometimes those two exhibits are kind of like smashed in together, but normally we try to put a timeline on the landlord to get done what they're supposed to get done. I also try to get the tenant to be able to go in even while the landlord's doing their work, to try to get the tenant in there to be able to catch, try to get a head start on their work. But so that if you can put a timeline on the landlord, which sometimes they will or won't let you do, if you can put a timeline, then you can rely on it and say, look, you're supposed to deliver it by this date. You didn't. So maybe you get a chance to terminate the lease, which probably isn't really what you want to do. Really, honestly, I mean, why would you put all that time, energy, and effort into it to just walk away from it? But, and this is a far cry, but I mean, you could, and we've gotten this a handful of times, is to actually get them to pay money for being late. They really, really don't like that. But I've gotten it sometimes for them to be able to do that because they're comfortable enough to know they're going to get it done in time.
Does it work vice versa too? So if they're early, do they pay them? I know that's how.
No, I didn't push back on that. In most of those startups like that, were ground up actually, where the whole building was ground up. And so what we said was, look, if you're taking this building from ground up, I need to know, I need to have a better idea when I'm going to be here. Because sometimes those ground up constructions, those landlords want them done, but construction, gosh, you never know what's going to happen sometimes. So they don't get it done, and then here we are waiting for them to get it done. And anyways, it can put you in a
no, it's super real. I mean, that literally happened in my case where I heard that they're waiting on their permit to allow the tenants in, but I think what happened was lien issues, that they weren't paying the contractors weren't releasing their lien for whatever reason. They didn't get paid. And that delays all the tenants from getting in because your landlord's not paying his bills, and that costs you money. If you're if you left your job or whatever, that's just costing you money. So I mean, it's a very very real thing. That's a good clause to have in there.
When most people think about a startup, they think that they are expensive and time-consuming. I'm here today to tell you that they are right, but it doesn't have to be. Starting a dental practice presents a list of challenges, but when it comes to making decisions about where to purchase your dental equipment, I recommend Dental Planet. Dental Planet provides affordable, comprehensive services that simplify the startup, expansion, or renovation process while dramatically improving your ROI of the entire project. If you need equipment, Dental Planet has new, factory recertified, and Dental Planet certified pre-owned digital imaging systems. As you know, a lot of your success as a startup is based on your ability to provide a great experience for your patients. The same can be said about Dental Planet. They provide telephone, email, and remote support, as well as multiple financing solutions. Dental Planet is even more affordable than many of their competitors. All products include a warranty backed by a nationwide network of service providers, along with expert sales consultants and technicians. Thousands of more items, including dental supplies, are also available when you use Dental Planet. Buying equipment for your startup doesn't have to be expensive with Dental Planet. You can save between 40 to 60%. See how easy and affordable upgrading, replacing, or expanding can be when you team up with Dental Planet. Just mention shared practices to get a discount on your already low prices. Learn more at dentalplanet.com. Again, that's dentalplanet.com. Again, mention shared practices to get a discount on your entire order.
Yeah, and it's like I said, it's one of those things where you're working on getting it in, and it really kind of depends on who it is and how you're able to negotiate it. So anyway, but yeah, I mean that's a big one. I think is from a pitfall standpoint for especially startups. Knowing when it starts and how it starts is important. It's a pitfall. I don't know that it's a pitfall, but you try to get exclusivity, obviously, in some form or fashion. I mean, do you want to be the only dentist in the building? Maybe you do. Do you maybe want to be the only orthodontist in the building? You probably need to be the only orthodontist in the building, likely. Are you the only oral surgeon? Okay. But some referral type of businesses like that, practices don't really need to maybe be the only one in there. But like a pediatric dentist may not want a general dentist there, competing against them. But at the same time, the general dentist may not really be too concerned about a pediatric dentist being next to them. So, you're kind of weighing those. And I guess, to the extent you were able to negotiate on the front end, making sure they're written in properly. I know, we're talking with dentists here, but I have a veterinarian who has a large pet store. We're negotiating a lease for a veterinarian. They have a large pet store next to them. And so the pet store has a exclusive for pet grooming. Yeah, my guy actually wants to do some pet grooming. And the way the exclusivity was written on behalf of the large pet store was that they couldn't have another tenant that's primary business was pet grooming. So guess what that means?
Yep.
My guy's primary business is not pet grooming. His primary business is a veterinary clinic. So he can do some pet grooming.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's good. It's great for your tenant. I guess bad for the large pet store.
Yeah, and I guess apparently they're not actually doing any of it right now. But I mean, if you're going to negotiate it, obviously you want to try to protect yourself as much as possible. And maybe when they negotiate it, maybe the landlord wouldn't let them have a full exclusivity on it. And it is a big ask. It is a big ask, I think, for a lot of landlords to give exclusivity. And I'll tell you, I think working with a lot of tenants, I think a lot of tenants take it for granted. Like, oh, well, why wouldn't they give me an exclusivity? Anytime you're locking in the landlord to something, it costs. It's important to know that it's not free. It's kind of a big deal. So
they're giving up the opportunity cost of a potential another tenant in a big market segment. So I mean, you are asking them to possibly lose business. So yeah, I get that too. But I mean, I guess you don't really put a lot of value in it unless you don't have it.
Right.
That's amazing. And so have you represented anybody that actually had tried to get out of a lease? Have you done that?
Yeah, we've had a couple. I had one that we were about to get out, and really it was more of a posture move on our part to get what we wanted. I did have one that was actually a ground up construction that was similar to what that issue I was telling you about before, where they weren't on time, and we did get out of it. Generally speaking, though, if you sign a lease, I mean, I think this is just I think it's good advice across the board. If you sign this thing, you better be planning on staying.
Yep.
Is that something where you just, I think I'm going to get out of it now? You're in it likely, but that does go to one of the other issues that we see a lot is the assignment and subletting. And again, I listen to these, I listen to podcasts myself and go to presentations. And so if anybody's looking at doing a lease, I'm sure you've heard about the importance of assignment and subletting and being able to try to have a little bit more freedom than what most, standard lease forms that your landlord's going to give you provide.
Explain that assignment subletting. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So assigning the lease basically means that you are transferring the lease over to somebody else, so that you could potentially still be on the hook. But the idea is, think about a piece of paper, the lease itself, and you're giving it to somebody. And that person now stands in your shoes and is in contract with the landlord. The subleasing is where you still are holding the piece of paper, but you are then creating a new piece of paper and having somebody downstream sublease from you. That's subleasing. And so landlords don't want you to just go and assign the lease to Joe Schmo that doesn't have any money, that has no business experience, and can't pay, or likely can't pay. And they don't want you subleasing to the marijuana grow shop for your lab back in the back. You got a marijuana grow shop, I mean, those are extreme cases, okay? But they just in general, they don't want you to be doing something unless they know about it and have control over it. Yep. So most leases have a provision that say that you just flat out cannot assign or sublease. And then it'll say, some of them, then most of them will say without, landlord's consent, and most of them will say in their sole discretion. Mm-hmm. And what it becomes is you start to peel away the onion. How far can you get away from the landlord having control over it? Landlords will hardly ever let you have full control over who you assign and sublease to, although in some cases with really dumb landlords, we've been able to get it. But, I mean, really, really dumb landlords, and I don't even think they've ever read their lease or the one I drafted my comments back to them. But either way, very often they're going to fight back on that. And so normally what we try to do is we try to allow you to assign in the event if you're going to sell it, or in the event you die or become disabled, because obviously you're not going to be able to operate the practice. And so the assignment subletting becomes a little bit easier in that event. So it's, there's a lot of different language. A lot of people will try to throw, won't unreasonably withhold consent. To me, I think that's a starter. I don't think that's, when I negotiate leases, I actually go further than that for tenants. And so, we're going to put that in there first off, and then we're going to say if you sell the practice, they're just going to straight up consent to it. That normally doesn't get approved. So, or if it doesn't get approved, then it normally doesn't. We're normally going to go then to something like, okay, well, if we sell it to somebody with as much net worth as us and business experience, then you're going to approve it. Mm-hmm. Obviously, if you die or become disabled, we're going to put something in there regarding either being able to terminate the lease, or they will accept an assignment or sublease in that event.
Sure. So there's a way of getting it in there, but triggered by a certain event.
Yes. Yep. Either selling the practice with somebody that's got some experience and money, or dying or becoming disabled. Kind of triggering events. Yes. Yep.
That's good to know. Anything else that you wanted to touch on? I know that you had some other topics on leases that you wanted to bring up in importance.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, I've got a list of things here, and and there's too much on here for an hour podcast. There really is. I mean, but I think a couple of these will be somewhat intuitive to people. Mm-hmm. So I'll just kind of run through them.
Sure.
I would recommend, first of all, having some sort of, business entity for your practice. And so I think you need to be entering into this lease with your business entity. Now, we talked about this much earlier in the podcast about having a guarantee and having a personal guarantee. But regardless, I recommend you having an entity. So you need to make sure that the parties are there, that yours is an entity, and that they're right. You also want to make sure that you have the actual premises, is what they call it, or leased premises, or demised premises, depending on what the lease says. That's basically your office, right? Your office space. We need to make sure that's defined and that it's clear on what you're actually renting from them. There's rent, which obviously we've talked about that a little bit, but what you need to look out for is the rent escalators. So most rent is going to escalate 2 to 3% year over year. Sometimes they'll put in a CPI, Consumer Price Index, escalations. Inflation is probably going to happen in the near future. And so if to the extent you can lock yourself into a 2% escalator, that's great. Normally we see around 3% escalators, but with CPI and inflation, if yours is tied to CPI, you may be having much higher escalators than what you can afford and what you would have thought. So you really need to look at the escalators and make sure those are drafted properly.
That's a good point. I haven't seen that one before.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's I think, and Jonas, I don't remember what yours was. I'm sure yours had one.
It's 3%.
Yeah, most of them. Yeah, so most of them, if you can get 2, that's fantastic. Anymore, most times, I mean, unless again it's that very, very unsophisticated landlord, sometimes they'll hold rent, which is so stupid of them because money costs more every day. So if you can lock your rent in and keep it that way for 10 years, like you're a winner. That would be really good for you. So the other one is the use provision. Obviously, we're looking at dental offices, but To the extent maybe you're going to be doing something different or want to make sure that that you can use it in a different way or maybe in a more broad way, we try to make our use provisions as broad as possible. The landlord's going to try to make them as tight and narrow as possible. And generally that use provision ties into the exclusivity in some form or fashion. And we obviously talked about that.
Okay.
Another good one is the options, right? So the term of the lease, 5, 10 years. You also want to probably have options, whether those are 2-year, 3-year, 5-year options. When do you exercise them? And how can you exercise them? I've seen leases from institutional landlords that require an entire year's notice.
Wow.
Entire year's notice. Yeah. So, I try to bump that thing down to 90 days to 120 days or 180 days is really normally where we end up falling, somewhere around 6 months. But you got to be careful. And you got to know that when that time comes, you need to be able to exercise that option. And if you don't, really these leases and all negotiations are all about leverage, probably like pulling a tooth, right? It's all about how much leverage you can get. And so here you don't want to be in an unleveraged position. And so if you didn't give proper notice, now they have all the leverage because they can say, well, you didn't give us notice. And so that means that we don't have to give you this space back at the rental rate that we all agreed to. And they'll jack the rent up if they want to.
Your previously signed lease is void, negotiate a new one with us, or pick up all your stuff and move it down the street.
Exactly. And they can do that. Those are the horror stories, right? So you just don't want to put yourself in that situation. Signage. So I think it's important for signage to be negotiated to the extent that it can be. Is there a monument sign? Is there a sign up, on top of the building, on the premises? You want to make sure that you have some signage to the extent you can, or it's appropriate for you. Some, maybe a pediatric dentist or an oral surgeon in a larger medical building, how much signage do they want? Probably enough signage to make sure people can get to their office because their practices are built on referral. But if you want, more signage, you're on the road. I know a lot of pediatric dentists are on the road, have really cool, fancy signs with kids playing or whatever. You just got to think about the signage, and it's got to make sure that you've got it in the lease if you want it. Yep. And then another big one is the maintenance. So who, what, when, where, how, and why, right? All those questions. Who's going to maintain? Who's going to maintain what? Who's going to pay for it when something needs to be maintained? And who's going to perform the maintenance? Those are all questions that have to be answered, and there's generally a provision. A handful of paragraphs regarding maintenance.
Yeah, for example, you just spent $20,000 on a AC compressor that goes on your roof, and who's in charge of maintaining that AC compressor? Because now the landlord owns it now. You pay for it, but they own it. Who's going to manage that? Something like that, or who damages the outside wall? Who pays for it? Correct?
Absolutely. Yep. 100%. So that's exactly what it is. AC is big, really big issue. Doors, sidewalks, walkways. Generally, those things are maintained by the landlord, but it's important to identify exactly what your maintenance obligation is. Really important.
Are you ever, just to interrupt, are you ever auditing the CAM fees? Are you ever auditing that? Because they can generally charge you, whatever is within reason, but are you ever actually executing that?
So I've had a couple tenants, actually the one where we were leveraging them to get out of or to really stay in the lease and get us better terms. We did do a limited audit on that. Generally, I'm not the one to audit it. I do have another client right now who's requesting the fees. I didn't negotiate the lease on the front end, but the CAM, common area maintenance expenses, or operating costs sometimes they're called, in the lease, it identifies what they are. It should also identify what they are not. So normally when we do that, we're going to put in a provision of what is not included in CAM. And then we also put a provision in to either review or audit those. I'll be honest with you, very seldom do I actually think they get audited, truly audited. Most landlords should be providing you a list of what they've, on an annual basis, normally when they tell you what the next year is going to cost, they should be giving you their costs for the last year. The thing about landlords, they generally shouldn't want to just go spend a ton of money, because the more they spend, the less competitive they become in the market as it relates to their CAM fees, unless they're totally lying to the prospective tenants about what their CAM fees are.
Sure.
But generally, I represent a couple landlords too. They don't just want to go spend money to go spend money. So, because all they're doing is spending it to get it back from you. And, but at the same time, you definitely want to tighten that up. And we do, with a couple of provisions in there, but that was a good point.
Okay. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. I'm just curious about that because you never know what they're charging. You get a bill, but it's built into it obviously, but they're in full control of it in the end. And, like how much does the lawn maintenance actually cost? How much are they actually paying for this? So it's good to, maybe actually see those numbers flushed out a little.
Yeah. And like I said, normally you put a provision in there that says, on an annual basis, you get a chance to review or audit. They don't like the word audit very much. So, you normally would say like review the expenses. And then if they're, greater than what they actually were, then unfortunately, if they're greater than what they actually were and you audited them, then you have to pay them. But if they're less, then they get to pay you. And then there's obviously expenses involved in you auditing it. They don't want to be paying all your expenses. So let's say you hired an attorney and accountant to audit all of them, and they were $5 off.
Yep.
Well, they're going to pay more money in the cost of you reviewing them than what they were off. So normally you put a threshold on how much they're off before they'll pay for your costs.
I gotcha.
Yeah,
that makes
5%
sense.
is usually pretty typical.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's cool. Anything else that we missed here on going through a lease for a startup?
I'll tell you, I've got a whole list of stuff.
Yes.
So you have to bring me back.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot that goes into it. I mean, it's a big deal.
Yeah, there's probably, we have a list of about 60 things that we go over. I'm not, there's no way would we talk about them on a podcast, but, there's probably still a handful here. I can rattle them off. What the tenant improvement allowance is, when are they going to be paid, how are they going to be paid? If you hold over, how much are you going to hold over? The improvements that you make, are they going to stay? How are they approved? The as-is clause is very important. Permitting and compliance with laws is important. You got to make sure the brokers are in there. If they're going to get paid, you don't want to get stuck paying the broker who you didn't think you were supposed to pay. From the landlord, what is the condition on turnover when you turn it over? There's a handful of things that we go through.
I'm just going to say the advice of get professional help when going through these leases. And then, even if they're in understandable language, there's stuff that it's between the lines that really matters when it comes to these things. Definitely have seek out professional help, whether it's Matt or whoever else is out there helping you out. But don't sign one of these things lightly and take it for granted because you don't know what you're signing unless you actually read through it. So I think that's important to understand. But Matt, I really appreciate your time. I mean, this has been awesome, and I got another LOI I got to send over to your way. So it's kind of timely that's why it's all kind of top of mind for me because what I'm going through. So I got to, kind of going through it again myself. So it's good to rehash and get familiar with it again. So again, I really appreciate your time and meeting me. And I think that your advice is invaluable. How can people reach out to you and get a hold of you if they need you?
Absolutely. Oh, thanks, Jonas. And it was a real pleasure being on here. If anybody wants to get a hold of me, they can, feel free to give me a call. My cell phone number is 269-760-1499. That's just how, responsive I am. I'll give that directly to you to all these people on the podcast. Okay. But what would probably be better is if you call my office line. My office line is 248-301-0123. It's 248-301-0123. And my website is LaMasterLaw.com. It's LaMasterLaw.com. My email address is really simple. It's Matt, M-A-T-T, at LaMasterLaw.com. And you can go on the website. There's a, connect with us button. You can click on there, send us an email that way, send me an email directly, give me a call, whatever. I'd be happy to help you, happy to talk with you. And we're a little bit different than most firms, Jonas, and we charge a flat fee, unlike a lot of attorneys that charge hourly. So try to give everybody an opportunity to know what things are going to cost them and be able to budget, for a startup like this.
Pretty cool. And I think it's, I think it's very awesome that you're active on these different dental forms. I know I found you through Dental Town. I mean, just, going out there and diving into the world of, of your clients, potential clients. I think that's awesome. Take the time and do that, because I think that more people should.
Absolutely. No, I love the community, and the people I serve. So I definitely try to do that. And I just appreciate you having me on here today. Be well, everybody, and thanks for listening.
Hey, thank you, Matt. Thanks for your time. You take care.
All right, Jonas. As somebody who went through it and listening to the episode, what were some of your biggest takeaways about your interview with Matt?
Yeah, Matt did a good job of breaking down the lease in a stepwise fashion. He had a huge list of things that we wanted to tackle, but unfortunately we didn't have time to get to them. Hopefully we can have him back on to kind of go through the rest of it. But there's so many key elements that are overlooked, and he has his so many point checklist that he goes through when reviewing these things, that you need somebody like that on your side when negotiating these leases.
And, going into the process, I always felt like one of the most important things about the lease was the tenant improvements. And so, what were some of the key takeaways on tenant improvements and, how to handle them in the whole negotiation?
I mean, that's a good one, because they're not, you don't always get that, and we did touch on that, that in some circumstances that you may get an eggshell built out, you might get a vanilla shell built out, or you might get tenant improved. And I didn't even know there's a difference, but you got to know exactly the condition of the site that you're going to receive it the day you get the keys, or the day commencement begins, because that's extremely important.
So do you think, as somebody who's looking to get a lease, what are some of the most important things that you would look for in a lease negotiation to see what are some of the things that you absolutely want to win?
Want to win? That's a good point. I honestly think that the number one thing when going after a lease is actually a landlord that wants to do business and has an understanding of who they're doing business with. A dentist statistically is the second highest. Was it the second least likely business to go bankrupt, like in the United States? I think veterinarians are number one.
Yeah, I think it's vet and then dental.
So you need to respect that. They're getting a great tenant, so you do have negotiating power. And so that was some of the pitfalls I ran into personally. But you definitely want to get a competitive lease rate, and then make sure they're not tacking on like the triple N or the CAM fees. They're not being too tacky about that. Being able to audit the CAM fees, or how much it's costing them to maintain the area. That's very important to keep them honest. Little tiny things like that. Non-competes within the area you're going to be at. I mean, there's so many things you have to look for. But I think he makes a good point of kind of bringing in light some of the major ones.
Yeah, and I think talking about leverage in the episode, I think like we talked about as a dentist looking to lease a location, you have a lot of leverage, seeing as we are a very reliable business. But it's only leverage if the other side understands the benefit. You know what I mean? And
Right.
I think in what you're talking about with your situation, the landlord may not have either respected it or did not know how good of a tenant you would have been or are.
You're right.
You know what I mean? So I think
Right.
that's another, making sure the other side understands what you bring to the table and using that as leverage.
Yeah, and also understanding your landlord or your customer, I guess, in this circumstance. Like, there's a big difference between what I would call a sophisticated landlord, someone that has like in-house counsel, a lawyer that's on site negotiating these leases nonstop, or somebody that is just a developer, local developer that's into commercial real estate, building out these shopping centers, building out these buildings, because there's definitely different strategies on how you tackle one over another.
So how would you tackle both of those situations? So what would change about your approach?
Sometimes in my circumstance, the individual developer was very emotional, and they were trying to make money on my deal as opposed to making a deal. And that's that's exactly what ruined the deal, is them trying to be very greedy, trying to use my lease as future leverage for additional bank loans to keep building out more locations. Does that make sense? They can show that their property is this much value because of this lease is so much value. And so that ruined the deal. But a sophisticated landlord is going to have multiple places, multiple locations, and want to do business and might be more willing to negotiate. And that was my experience with it. But that you can't put everyone in, you can't sum everyone up like that.
Oh yeah, and I think that's a great lesson in that. I think a lot of things with startups are very situational specific. In the fact that the specific landlord, the specific location, the timeline, and everything, and so a lot of it has to do with understanding those bigger concepts that were talked about in the episode, and mainly understanding if you do or don't have leverage, and the other side's desires to do a deal. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. What are they getting out of me signing this lease? And kind of looking at it from that perspective can help shine a little light on their thinking.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes when you talk about lease negotiations, it has a tendency to not be like the most exciting thing. But I really think with startups, it's one of the most important topics to cover. So I'm really happy you had Matt on and you guys talked about it because it is a very important topic. And I'm really happy that our listeners got that perspective that he has.
I appreciate it.
All right. And we'll see you guys next week with another episode of the Shared Practices Podcast.